Mr. Bannon?
Yeah, hi, right here. I can hear you. How you doing?
Perfect. Yes, and let's start our interview with Miles Guo's whistleblowing. Daniel?
Good morning, Mr. Bannon. So, Daniel, my question is, according to Miles Guo's recent whistleblowing, the CCP has a secret strategy to incite racial hatred among the colored people against the whites. Do you think it's related to the current racial conditions in the United States? Thank you.
I think the CCP, look, the Chinese Communist Party has many different strategies, and I think Miles is on the one. I think they're trying to stir up not just animosity here in the United States, but throughout the world. I think their major thrust is their capture, what we call elite capture. Their capture of elites on Wall Street, the capture of elites in corporate America, their capture of elites on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. I think, and also the cultural elites through what Confucius Institutes and the money they give the universities and these other institutions. So look, I follow Miles very closely because Miles has been just amazing about what he's said is coming. You know, if people had listened to Miles Guo when Miles Guo first came to America back in 2000, or London in America back in, I think it was in 2017, 2016, they would have been in much better. We would have been in much better shape today. So I don't put anything past the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, I think their major thrust to me is among elite capture and influence peddling and control of the elites in the West and in the United States.
Perfect. And my second question is pretty much related because a professor called Jin Rong of Renmin University asserts that the U.S. prevents 1.4 billion Chinese people from living a decent lives, and that to defeat the U.S. is the only way out for China. What is your argument?
My argument is the exact opposite. In fact, I think that when you see the diaspora, of which the whistleblower movement and the new federal state of China are part of the Chinese people that have had to leave their homeland and go throughout the world, is that when they get into the West, and they have rule of law, they have protection of property rights and really protection of their freedoms, they thrive and prosper. And that's one of the reasons the show, The War Room, we're so focused on Lao Beijing and the what we call the slave labor of China, of which the Chinese Communist Party, which is nothing more than a gangster regime, oppress the Chinese people. Remember, my thesis of this, and I think Miles would agree, is that the great story, when you look at all the different things happening in the world, one of the most important stories in the world in the first half of the 21st century is going to be the freedom of the Chinese people. You know, let's step back and think about this for a second and put it in context of what the professor's saying. For what, I don't know, 10, 15,000 years, one of the world's great civilizations, the Chinese civilization, it's the only real country now that doesn't have freedom. And look, there's sections of the world very small where there's oppression by dictators, but here you have an entire civilization, and not just that, one of the greatest civilizations in mankind's history that has given so much of philosophy and thinking and science and art and family orientation, social structure, that has given so much to the world. And yet we're sitting here in the 21st century, and the 1.4 billion are totally enslaved by a gangster regime, right? Only made up of 90 million people, right? Which most of the world doesn't understand. They think all the Chinese are communists. And more importantly, of that 90 million, as you know, only a very small clique actually controls things. And they're the wealthiest families in the world, right? Wan Shan, all these individual families and factions are among the most wealthiest families in the world. They're far wealthier than the sheikhs and the princes and kings in the Gulf Emirates. So it's their enslavement that is the point here, and they're fighting for their freedom throughout the world. One of the things that most inspires me is the Chinese I have met throughout the rest of the world. They're all fighting for the freedom of the Chinese people and putting their own prosperity at risk, putting their own families at risk, putting their own safety at risk. And it's quite frankly very inspiring. One other aspect, I just want to make sure you know, Remember, the regime in Beijing is completely materialistic, totally anti-spiritual, totally anti-religious. They're atheistic, radical atheistic materialists, right? And that's where you see, wherever your religious outlooks, whether it's Islam, like in the Uyghurs, or it's the Falun Gong, the spiritual, the Tibetan Buddhists and the Dalai Lama, the underground house evangelical Christians, the underground Catholic Church, that spiritual yearning of the Chinese people for something greater than themselves is, to me, also one of the big motive forces in the fight for freedom by Lao Beijing and the Chinese people. Only the Chinese people can free themselves. People in the West who admire them and hold them very dear as great people can support that. And, you know, as you know, in the War Room and other things I work on, and other people in Europe and the United States support the whistleblower movement, support the new federal states, support the Chinese freedom fighters. But what's interesting, like in the Christian faith, you know, there's I think the Express newspaper in London, England, said the other day, what she fears is not the American military. He doesn't fear the American government. He doesn't fear Wall Street or the City of London or the Tory party or the British government or even the party of Davos. Doesn't fear the Vatican. What he fears more than all is the 300 million, I think, potential underground Christians in China. That's what he fears. He knows, because he knows that the Chinese, connected with something greater than themselves, are an unstoppable force. And I've said this before, I think the driving force, not just in their freedom of the Chinese people, but even afterwards, the driving force in Christianity in the 21st century will be led by the persecuted church in China. Just like the church in Rome in first century Christianity was a church that actually ended up thriving after the brutal persecutions by the Roman Empire. You're going to see the same thing coming out of China. You're going to see that the Christian faith is going to be led by Lao Beijing, by the very humble, very dedicated, very focused Chinese people that are being persecuted by these devils in Beijing.
Fantastic. Only the Chinese people can free themselves. And this world is also waking up against the CCP. Dr. Ming, your question, please.
Thank you very much, Castle. Mr. Bannon, my question is, after the Canadian and Dutch parliaments passed resolutions condemning the CCP's genocide in Xinjiang, more countries are likely to follow suit. What impact do you expect will be exerted on the CCP? Thank you.
Dr. Manning, it's a great question. What I would like to see, and I see some parliaments and governments around the world are getting focused on this now, but I think we have to go back to a massive, huge problem we have here in the United States. Remember, it was Mike Pompeo that basically put forward the State Department and approved by President Trump in the last days of the administration. I think it was on the last Friday of the administration with like 5 days to go, that designated the regime in Beijing as a genocidal regime about the Uyghurs. I happen to think it should actually been put in a broader context. I think they're genocidal by more groups than just the Uyghurs, but that was the start. We haven't, and I think that came too late. I think we should have done it much earlier. I think we should have taken that to the UN Security Council immediately and confronted the CCP at the UN Security Council, where you've seen other legislatures, parliaments, governments now start to focus on this. And as you said, a couple start to pass things. The Biden administration has been very, they haven't rescinded it totally, but they're under review. And I think it's important and incumbent upon the Biden administration to take the leadership here. And not just that, the Biden administration has to take the leadership, and the Gulf Emirates. The Gulf Emirates and Iran and all these, nations that are predominantly Muslim or Islamic. And that's where President Trump brought them all together in the spring of 2017 that led to the Abraham Accords, right? A lot of these countries are the first country to start when you talk about, issues dealing with radical jihad in the West, and particularly in Western Europe and the United States. A lot of the elements in those countries are the first to come up and say, oh, this is discrimination, all that, when it's not. It's about radical jihad. It's not about Islam overall. The non-response of those nations to this situation, along with the weakness of the Biden administration, is just not acceptable. Okay, just not acceptable. And so I think that It's good that the parliaments of the world are coming together and people seeing it because it's absolutely a case of genocide. But we need the Biden administration to step up here and to get very serious about this, start to take it to its next logical conclusion of what it means when you designate somebody a genocidal regime, what that means legally, right? And we need to be using all of our efforts in the Middle East to get the nations, the Islamic nations, to condemn the regime in Beijing. History is going to condemn those people that did not stand up for the Uyghurs and did not make their situation known. As I would say, the underground Christians, the Falun Gong, the Dalai Lama, and the Tibetan Buddhist, many groups of religious orientation in China today.
Thank you, Mr. Bannon.
Yes, not only the genocide in Xinjiang, but also the CCP is suppressing the freedom in Tibet and Hong Kong. Sky-san, your question, please.
Hello, Mr. Bannon. My question is 47 Hong Kong pro-democracy activists were charged on Monday for subversion under the national security law. What can the outside world do to help Hong Kong?
The outside world's got to show some courage. I have said consistently over the last couple of years, and once again, this is Miles Guo back in, 2019, I think it was, to start to basically show the issues. He was ahead of, on his broadcast, of which I was honored to join, ahead of what the situation in Hong Kong was going to be, and he predicted that if the West did not stand up here, that what you saw yesterday was going to happen. It's a tragedy for the people of Hong Kong and the people of mainland China, but it's a disgrace to the West. It's a disgrace to the United States. It's a disgrace to the United Kingdom, Europe, the powers of Australia, Japan, but really I think the West. I think principally the West. This has happened to us before. I keep calling Hong Kong basically the Czechoslovakia of the 1930s. Is what Hong Kong is today. The West had an opportunity to stand up to Hitler in those days, in the late 1930s, about his annexation of Czechoslovakia, and did not do it. And that really got us on the path to war. And here, let's be honest, the West did not do enough. And even the Trump administration, I think people like Pompeo and others would say we didn't do enough. It's incumbent upon, and that's why on the show we continue to hammer this. It's incumbent upon the United States and Boris Johnson and the government in the United Kingdom and Europe to, I think, now confront the Chinese Communist Party gangster regime in Beijing about what's going on in Hong Kong. I mean, it's beyond a tragedy. All of these freedom fighters are now going to be put in high security prisons, I think ultimately taken into the mainland and, tortured, kept for many years. And they've clamped down on all the freedoms in Hong Kong. And the West has just sat there, just looking on, right? Still in business with them. If you look at people in the United States, all these groups, all these business groups want to just go back to the old days. There's a big article in the Wall Street Journal today by Pat Toomey, the U.S. Senator, and Phil Gramm, who ran for president back in the 1990s. Excuse me. That said about protectionism not working and everything we did against the Chinese Communist Party in the Trump administration not working economically, which one is wrong and two misses the larger context about the confrontation with the Chinese Communist Party. So this is a tragedy for the Chinese people. It's an unspeakable tragedy for the Hong Kong people. It's an unbearable tragedy for the freedom fighters of Hong Kong who are so brave. And history will not judge us well that the West stood by and just watched this and allowed the lies of the regime in Beijing, with no sanctions on any of the big financial institutions, not breaking the convertibility of the Hong Kong dollar, and not sanctioning individually, not the people in Hong Kong, Carrie Lam and that crowd, but I mean go right to Beijing, Wan Shi, Shan Shi. Their family should have been personally sanctioned. So this is a disgrace. But this fight's not over. This is something we're fighting here in the United States, and hopefully we'll be able to turn around and get people's focus. But this is a this is a black mark on the West.
Yes, the West, especially the U.S., is very, very important in our war against the CCP. And Daniel, your question, please.
As the former United States president, what is the Trump strategy now against the CCP? Thanks.
I think you're seeing it from the key I would look to is I think the people that got sanctioned. You remember 4 minutes into the Biden administration, right after he took the oath of office, at 12:04, Mike Pompeo, Matt Pottinger, the National Security Advisor, Peter Navarro, and myself, among others, were all sanctioned at the heaviest sanctions they could give by the Chinese Communist Party to send the signal that these are bad guys and we will mess with them financially and economically and with their freedoms. So you don't want to be like them. It was a signal both to people in the United States and on Wall Street and corporations, but also a signal to the Biden administration. And I think you're going to see, if you've seen the activities of Pompeo and Navarro and myself and people like Steve Cortez, we're now more fire breathers than we were even during the Trump administration about confrontation with the Chinese Communist Party. So this is also, if you look at CPAC, I think there were 3 or 4 panels just on China and the CCP. If you look at all the polling, it's now totally shifted that the American people understand the problem we have here. We have to educate more and more and more about it's the Chinese Communist Party. It's not the Chinese people. It's not China. That's one of the things that I work on every day. So I think you're going to see, and remember, President Trump has already said he's going to be back engaged. He's the leader of the Republican Party for 2022, and I'm sure he's going to run again in 2024 as things sit right now and win. And China, the CCP and the takedown of the CCP, that difference between the accommodation and what they call, oh, we're just going to compete with them, we're going to outcompete them, versus those of us that said, no, we're going to confront them and we're going to assist Lao Beijing and the Chinese people to take them down. That's the dividing line right now. I believe you're going to see and I see all the numbers coming our way right now, and I can tell you from the War Room's audience, which is pretty massive, this people that want to support Lao Beijing and want to support the Chinese people in their fight for freedom. So this is going to be a huge political issue. It's only going to get bigger. Chinese Communist Party is going to be taken down. Of that, there's no doubt. And I happen to believe it's going to be taken down much sooner than people think. I think, as I said, the first half of the 21st century, when the history is written of this era, it will be one of the most important, if not the most important story, will be about the Chinese people winning their freedom, right? And those that assisted the Chinese people in the winning of their freedom, I think will be looked on very favorably by history. And the people that opposed that are the people that just didn't have courage and accommodated and appeased the devils from Beijing, this illegitimate criminal gang, will be looked at as basically people that supported one of the worst regimes in the history of mankind.
Yes, we will miss President Trump, and we hope he will return maybe later. But we face more present danger right now. Stella, your question, please.
Okay, thank you. According to Mao School, the Myanmar military is supported by the CCP replayed Tiananmen Square massacre. What is the significance in your view?
I think this is huge because I think you're seeing the CCP looking at probing the Biden administration for weakness. I think they're out all the littoral nations. Look, the biggest hotspot. Remember, you have information and cyber warfare, you have economic warfare, and you have kinetic war. Right? That's all laid out in unrestricted warfare. The Chinese CCP never wants to confront the West militarily because they think they can win with both information war and economic warfare. But they're prepared to make it as the confrontation as tough as possible. And that's what you're seeing. The number one hotspot in the world is the South China Sea. That's where all the commerce that goes through the allies from India and Australia, Indonesia, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and the United States. It's why it's the most important waterway in the world. The reason I fell in love with China. I'd always wanted to go to Asia, and I became as a young officer part of the Pacific Fleet and actually sailed and patrolled the South China Sea. For basically 4 years on and off, besides doing things in the Persian Gulf and the North Arabian Sea. but in that we were keeping that waterway free for all commerce, for all nations. The South China Sea is a hotspot, and the Chinese Communist Party is doing everything they can to try to control that. That was the very first confrontation we had with them before President Trump was even president, just after he was elected. They came to confront us because of our taking a phone call from Taiwan. They're testing the Biden administration because they sense weakness. They feel weakness. They just came out, and President Trump's administration ended, right, in really a crescendo of things against the Chinese Communist Party. You know, call them a genocide regime, putting the report out about the Wuhan lab being the source of the, in all likelihood, the source of the CCP virus, talking about other aspects of confrontation with the Chinese Communist Party. All these things that were done in the last days of administration came forward. The director of national intelligence saying the CCP had actively interfered in the 2020 campaign. So they're testing for weakness right now, the Biden administration. Biden is compromised by Xi. He's compromised by the Chinese Communist Party, there's no doubt. The hard drive from hell of Hunter Biden shows the compromise, right? Both money and other aspects, right? How they honey trap people. But they've compromised the Biden family, and I think they've compromised the Biden administration. Biden administration is trying to talk tough, but they're not acting tough.
Exactly. The CCP must be sanctioned. The only problem is how will the CCP get sanctioned? We recognize that Republicans introduced a bill to sanction the CCP's United Front Work Department. If the bill is passed, how helpful will it be for taking down the CCP?
It's very helpful, but it's a first step, but it's not going to happen with the Democrats. That's why we got to shame the Democrats. Remember, Nancy Pelosi first got involved in politics. She was one of the biggest fire breathers for a democracy movement and Tiananmen Square movement. Remember, the Chinese, the diaspora that's around the Bay Area and in San Francisco is very prominent and very powerful, right? She was a big part of that freedom community. In fact, remember, I think she wasn't arrested, but she was hassled by CCP police in Tiananmen Square at one of the anniversaries. She used to be really at the forefront of the freedom movement, and she's kind of backed away because of her financial involvement with Silicon Valley and the tech industry. The tech oligarchs who all want to be in business with the CCP. So that bill to become life has to get more teeth in it, but we have to get past, and to do that, we're going to need Democrats. I mean, the great exercise that we're going through for the new federal state and the diaspora of the Chinese people to see in the United States is how messy democracy is. Democracy is very messy. It's still the best form of government we've ever seen because people get a say so, but it's very messy. It's not authoritarian. And I think you're seeing these bills. I would love to see these bills passed. Quite frankly, I'm very disappointed in the Republican study group under Jim Banks did this whole set of studies of all the different legislation could be done, and I didn't think it was strong enough. I thought it really pulled its punch. And I think part of that is the influence of the donor class with the big corporations in the Republican Party. So we have a big fight ahead of us. But I think you're going to see, as every day goes on, more of the confrontation with the CCP is going to become predominant because people in the United States understand that, and particularly the working class and middle class people are understanding more and more each day that they're a criminal regime in Beijing that has to be confronted. Guys, I have to go. I want to thank you. Your questions are always fantastic, and I love doing this show. I really do. So it's a highlight for me every week.
Thank you, Mr. Bannon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bannon.
Dr. Ming, you've done a very good job. Your host and your host in training and your questioners are always, I say this, it's always the best questions I get every week, week in and week out from all the media worldwide. You have the most well thought through and perceptive questions that really require real thinking to answer, just not rote talking points. So I want to thank you very much. I'm always honored to be on the show.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bannon. And my team will work very hard so that we can live up to your expectation. We'll try. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ming.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bannon.
Thank you.
Okay, you got it, Ken. Cool.